Well, let's now have a look at Australia's housing system. So Australia's housing system is really characterized by two main areas of policy dependency. So the first of these area is the market dependency. And you'll realize that in the Australian context, housing is primarily seen as a market responsibility. In that sense, housing is mainly provided through market transactions with limited government interventions. So typically we see people purchasing their own homes and others really engaging in private rentals or other forms of, housing, people who stay in Airbnb for a few days or in hotels and so on and so forth. So this arrangement under the market path dependency operates under the assumption that the market will meet consumer demand. However, as we have observed and as it has been highlighted in the news, the market is not meeting demand as effectively as we would like. And this is currently actually leading to what is now referred to as the housing crisis, which comes with lots of stress across the communities. The second path dependency relates to spatial arrangements. And this really refers to how housing availability follows patterns established by long-term infrastructure and land market planning. For example, as new roads and infrastructures are developed, surrounding land is often released and developed for future housing. This could also mean really densification, like the increase in apartment buildings, which we now see in areas such as West End, South Bank, or even South Brisbane, where we currently can see significant construction activities. So alongside this, there is fringe expansion where new land is often, opened up on the edges of existing areas. We can think here of the new land release signs you might see when driving to the Logan or towards the Gold Coast. So what is important to consider here is also that land is often released after key infrastructures such as, roads or water supply or electricity is already established so that the area can be determined to be livable and then people can start, getting their own lands in these different areas, as actually you can see on one of these two pictures. So these spatial arrangements, unfortunately, although they are very important, they actually get to increase inequality between people living in different areas and under different housing conditions. And this also gets to determine who can get access to housing, who can't get access to housing, and under which conditions actually, in context where you are actually maybe getting a mortgage or just planning to buy a new land and be a first home buyer. So the next point we might want to consider is now the institutional arrangements. And as we said in the other weeks, really institutional arrangements refer to the ways stakeholders involved in a certain policy are involved in a certain area of social policy. And we are thinking here of their responsibilities in terms of funding, interventions, and even how they get to participate in the delivery of a certain social service. So in Australia, actually all tiers of government are involved in shaping the production, the consumption, and exchange of homes, as well as all of the related services and amenities. So while this might seem quite positive, actually it comes with its own challenges and complexities. In practice, this could probably sometimes create complexities, particularly regarding the responsibilities for resolving housing crisis. And we see this a lot between the federal government and the state level government when they are participating in debates on who should be responsible of what in addressing actually the housing crisis. So also important to consider here is how government gets to shape housing policy. Actually, government gets to shape housing policy in three main ways. One is regulation, and that involves planning laws, building codes, mortgage industry, and all the other aspects which might be related to regulation and making sure that current housing practices are following the regulations and laws in place. The second is subsidy. This refers to things such as taxation or grants, such as the grants often offered to first home buyers and so on and so forth, but also taxation such as capital gains tax and negative gearing for people who are buying houses. And the last one, of course, is provision, which comes through public and social housing. And we shall speak about this in details as we go in this recording. So public housing is housing delivered by state or territory governments at a rate below the value market. Social housing, by contrast, is typically something which is delivered by non-government organizations at a similarly reduced rate. So in a sense, there is a kind of really difference between what we call public housing and social housing. So and while these terms are sometimes used interchangeably, it's important to distinguish that public housing specifically refers to provision by the government. And this is what we are really talking about, mostly when we speak about, housing policy. Now, the role of state level and territory government somehow overlaps with the role of federal government or the Commonwealth government. In a sense, the state level and territory government mostly is in charge of overseeing policies that directly affect the housing market, things such as land release, zoning, and taxation, and even issues of social housing and homelessness policies. Whereas the federal government oversees policies that indirectly affect housing or the housing market, including things such as migration, tax settings, financial services regulation, and all those other aspects which might affect the housing policy or the housing sector in an indirect way. And of course, when it comes to funding social housing, for example, and funding for social housing and for specialist homelessness services is often something the state and territory level of government are in charge of, whereas the federal government provides funding to state level and territories for social housing and homelessness. And in a sense, the federal government provides most of the funding, whereas the state level is kind of in charge of implementing and making sure that things are happening or being done in a certain way. So, although some of these responsibilities are shared, such as policy response to housing, affordability, and funding of particular programs, there is actually limited overlap in direct delivery, and this often remain largely the domain of the state and territory, which again, as I said, are in charge of the implementation of the housing policies. So one way we can really think about this also is that state and territory government play a much more direct and active role in intervening in the housing market, whereas the federal government plays a more indirect role, which is quite focused on, funding, but also regulation mostly, rather than just directly intervening, because that's often performed by the state level and territory level of government. So in the upcoming slides, we'll explore the specific institutional arrangements at different levels of government. So we'll begin with the federal level, then discuss the state level using the Queensland model, actually, and finally we shall try to touch on local government using Brisbane as a case study. So please make sure that you take a moment to review the next few slides, which provide further details and examples. Thank you very much, and see you in the next recording.